Okay, welcome. So, this week we're still reading and we're still talking about Romeo and Juliet, but since we're already talking love stories and beautiful language and poetry about love, I thought this would be the most appropriate place to slip in a little bit of info about Shakespeare's sonnets because they're part, a really important part of Shakespeare's overall works too. So it's good to know a little bit about them. Okay, first things first, the basics. What is a sonnet? So a sonnet is a highly structured, follows rules, it's type of formal poem. There's always 14 lines, and there's a strict rhyming pattern. So the rhyming pattern will change based on which type of sonnet it is. Um, the sonnet originated with the Italians, so there's the Petrarchan sonnet, but then the English take it up, and Shakespeare developed his own rhyming scheme. So his rhyming scheme is known as the Shakespearean sonnet. Um, Shakespeare's sonnets use iambic pentameter. Hopefully, you've heard of that before because it's, I don't know, a really important foundational structure of English poetry. And this is when, in iambic pentameter, there are 5 metrical feet of 2 syllables each for each line in the poem. And Shakespeare uses iambic pentameter all the time, even throughout his plays, even. But it's definitely in the sonnets. So um, the pattern is that there's first a short unstressed syllable followed by a long stressed syllable for 10 total syllables per line. And that's sort of the da 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 rhythm. And we'll take a look at that in just a minute. Okay, also for the Shakespearean sonnet, the rhyme scheme that Shakespeare uses is A B A B C D C D E F E F G G. And we'll take a look at that rhyme scheme too in just a minute. So, first, the example of iambic pentameter from the sonnets. This is sonnet 18. Now, when most people read these out loud, they don't stress this syllable, this rhythm, but it's there underneath it. So to really overemphasize it, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Okay, you get the idea. That sort of da 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 da. That's the iambic pentameter. And like I said, when these poems are read out loud, that they don't normally say it in that super sing-songy way, but that syllable stressed pattern is still there. Okay, and then for the rhyme scheme, like I mentioned before, you can see how the rhyme scheme works out here. You have the first quatrain, which is A, B, sun and dun rhyme, red and head rhyme. Then we switch rhymes to C, D, white and delight rhyme, cheeks and reeks rhyme. Then a new quatrain of rhymes, know and go rhyme, and sound and ground rhyme. And then at the very end, we have what's called the couplet, GG, rare and compare rhyme. And in your book, the Norton sets off the couplet a little bit. Some editors will also divide up the quatrains into sections too, but that is the typical rhyming pattern of a Shakespearean sonnet. Okay, so for Shakespeare's sonnets, for his collection of sonnets, there were 154 total sonnets that he wrote that are at least in this collection. And they were published in his lifetime in a quarto in 1609, but it's fairly unclear if this publication was authorial, whether Shakespeare supported this publication or not. And we'll talk about some reasons why it may not have been authorial. But just some other textual information. The poems were probably written over a span of about a decade or so, between 1594 and 1604. And Scholars have lots of theories about when certain groups of those poems would have been written. So they weren't all written at once, and they weren't necessarily written to be in a complete total collection this way. Um, but that is the way that they were published in the Quarto, in this order, in this collected in this way. And so it's so there's lots of scholars who like to speculate that the order is intentional, that they're meant to be in this order, and that there's a certain relationship. It's very clear that some of the poems are very much connected and very much related, but as a whole, overall, it's less clear if they were really intended to be in this order or in this structure. So before they were published, they were likely circulated in manuscript form. Okay. So there was this tradition, it was called manuscript culture. There was this tradition of where you would have what were called coteries, society groups or intellectual groups, groups of friends who socialized together, who would circulate manuscripts around of various poetic arts. So Shakespeare very likely belonged to maybe a coterie of playwrights or maybe some sort of social coterie of certain educated people that he specifically wrote these sonnets to be read by. And then the manuscripts of these poems would have been circulated around those groups. So it is very likely that Shakespeare had a super specific audience in mind when he was writing these poems, and that they weren't necessarily written for the general population or written for general consumption, just from what we know of how manuscript culture worked. He probably wrote these poems knowing everyone in the group, um, knowing how they would respond to his poems, and having this very specific audience in mind. So that's one of the reasons why there's a question mark over whether the publication was authorized or not, whether he actually meant them to be read by a wider audience. As well, there's some other reasons why the publication is questioned. It's possible. It's possible Shakespeare wanted them to be published, but also possible that he only ever meant for them to be circulated in manuscript form among a very select group of people. So let's talk about the content of the poems themselves. They are love poems. They are. But they raise a lot of questions. So the poems are usually divided into two groups. The first 126 poems, 1 to 126, appear to be addressed to a young male lover, a young man, that the author is definitely erotically attracted to. Now, that doesn't mean that so pronouns are interesting. Not every single poem uses pronouns, so it can go either way sometimes. Who was being addressed in the poem, but definitely there is the pattern of a young man being very specifically addressed throughout this section of poems. Then in 127 there's a switch, and 127 to 154 through the last portion of the sonnets, they are addressed to and about a dark mistress. So everyone is really tempted to read the sonnets biographically. And given what we know about manuscript culture, or given what's in the poems themselves, it's very tempting. It's very tempting to say that the speaker of the poem is William Shakespeare himself, and that the young man and the dark mistress that he is addressing are real people. So people have spent a lot of time trying to figure out who these people could have been. So what I have here is a portrait of one potential option. This is Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton. This portrait was made sometime between the ages of 17 and 20, so he was definitely a young man when this portrait was made. Other suggestions, there's another Earl, William Herbert, the third Earl of Pembroke. That's a possible candidate for Shakespeare's young man that he addresses. and we'll talk about some reasons why those two young men specifically are candidates in just a second. This right here is a portrait of a Mary Fitton, and she is often cited as being one of the primary candidates for Shakespeare's Dark Lady. Usually just for the fact that Mary Fitton had an affair with William Herbert, third Earl of Pembroke, and the young man of Shakespeare's Sonnets also has an affair with the Dark Mistress, but there's really, there's other names have been put forward too, other poets or just other women, and we'll talk about some other possibilities too in just a second for who the Dark Lady could be. But there's a very thin evidence for all of this, like super, super thin evidence. It's all basically conjecture. There's no evidence really that Mary Fitton knew Shakespeare at all. So anyway, like I said, it's all conjecture, whether these are real people or not. So there's that. Let's get to the elephant in the room then. If we're reading these poems biographically, and a good majority of these poems are erotically addressed to a young man, and then the last half are addressed to a woman, does this mean that Shakespeare was gay, or at the very least bisexual? Okay, so it's a very complicated question to answer, all right? Much like asking whether Hamlet was mad or at least depressed, you have to remember that, like mental health at the time, gender and sexuality were just viewed very differently back in Shakespeare's day in the early modern period. The first thing to understand is that the terms gay and bisexual didn't exist, and that sexual identities also didn't exist. Like, people did not define themselves as a homosexual or a heterosexual. Those words, those concepts, those ideas of a sexual identity, those are much more modern concepts. So they didn't really exist in the early modern period the way they did. So people could commit homosexual acts, but that didn't necessarily define their identity. So the second thing to understand is that things would have been viewed differently back then, and it's kind of really hard to understand or to know or to grasp how acceptable it would have been to engage in homosexual activity. On the one hand, it does seem to have been accepted in certain ways. So there was a tradition of homosocial or homoerotic behavior that sort of influenced by Greek and Roman culture that was very much in vogue at the time. It was almost viewed as preferable, and it's hard to say that with any certainty, but it being in love, or because men were viewed as higher than women, higher and more worthy than women, being in love with a man was considered to have a more pure form of love than being in love with a woman. That is one possible way that homoerotic love was viewed at the time. It's also possible that homoerotic actions were not as policed as they were in later centuries because homoerotic actions, homosexuality was safe because it was sterile. So what was policed at the time, very policed and very much concerned people, was male-female relations because of the danger of pregnancy or unintended offspring, which could seriously mess up social structures. It could mess up family structures. It could mess up inheritance. So it was very important to police who when women and men had sex together, because unintended pregnancies could really mess up social structures. Male-male relationships, sterile, so not quite as policed. That being said, so having this understanding, it was still seen as a sin. It was still frowned upon by the church. Um, and it still wasn't super common necessarily. So it's really tricky for us to know and to understand how homosexual behavior or how homoerotic desires would have been viewed socially at the time. Um, really quite hard to get a good handle or a good grasp on it. It's possible that in certain places it was common and accepted, possible in other places, especially religious spaces, it was still very much condemned. um, so if you look at the other thing to note about it is that Shakespeare was also unique in writing homoerotic poetry at the time. There weren't very many other poets at the time who were writing love letters to young men. Um, so that's just another complicating factor of, was this normal or was it not? Was this acceptable or was it not at the time? Certainly in the centuries since Shakespeare, 1700s, 1800s, and early 1900s, obviously homosexuality, it was even illegal in certain countries and very much frowned upon, and so people tried to hide or cover up or explain away the fact that Shakespeare was writing erotic poetry to a young man. So the question was Shakespeare actually in love with a young man, right? Was he actually, can we read this poetry as biographical? Well, if you look, this is a complicated question to answer, because if you look at the first 15 to 20 sonnets of the collection, they are actually they're called the procreative sonnets because they are all about trying to convince the young man to get married to a woman and to reproduce, to have children, based on the argument. This is the argument that Shakespeare's making, that the young man is so beautiful that he owes it to humanity and nature to keep his gene pool going, to produce more beautiful people, which is a really interesting argument from a modern perspective for a man to be making to another man he's in love with. Let's just take a look. This is the first sonnet. From fairest creatures we desire increase, that thereby beauty's rose might never die. But as the riper should by time decrease, his tender air might bear his memory. Okay, so he's saying, from beautiful people, we want more beautiful people, that beauty's rose might never die. And when you get old, you'll have a beautiful air for us to all remember your beauty by. But thou, contracted to thine own bright eyes, feedest thy light's flame with self-substantial fuel, making a famine where abundance lies. So the young man seems to be opposed to getting married. Thyself, thy foe, to thy sweet self too cruel, thou that art now the world's fresh ornament, and only herald to the gaudy spring, within thine own bud buryest thy content, and tender churl makest waste in niggarding. So the young man seems to be wasteful in that he's not getting married and having children. Pity the world, or else this glutton be to eat the world's due by the grave and thee. So what's interesting about this collection is that there's theories out there that this first group of poems, that's really, it repeats this message heavily, telling this young man that he needs to get married because he's so beautiful and he needs to reproduce children. It is theorized that that this group of poems was actually commissioned, that Shakespeare was asked to write them by the family of some beautiful young man who was refusing to get married. And that's one of the reasons why people think that it was William Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke, because he repeatedly mentioned that he refused to get married, and that he was not going to get married. And, that's a big deal for an earl to not get married and to not reproduce, because that ends a family line. So there's thoughts that Shakespeare was asked by the family of the young man to write these poems to try to convince him to get married. And this is the route Shakespeare takes. However, there does seem to be a shift or a point where where Shakespeare stops, and it's unclear if it's the same young man or if he's moved on to a different young man, but where Shakespeare stops urging him to get married and instead suggests that his beauty can live on forever by virtue of Shakespeare's pen. And this is actually going back to an old Greek and Roman ideal too, that there's two paths to immortality. And the first path to immortality is procreation through children. You live vicariously through your children and your children's children, and your pieces of you, which today we know are genes and DNA, actually get passed on through your children. And so having children is one path to immortality. The second path to immortality, of course, is to um, achieve great feats that are told about in stories, and the stories get passed down. And as long as you're told about in stories, you're never forgotten, and that's the second path to immortality. So at some point, Shakespeare drops this line of urging the young man to get married to produce children as a path to immortality, and instead claims that he will live forever in Shakespeare's sonnets. So we'll take a look at this one's Sonnet 18, and this one's famous. You've probably heard this one, but you may not have known that it was addressed to a young man, or at least it's assumed that this is addressed to a young man. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the high of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. Okay, so nature is beautiful, but nature changes. Summer ends, fall happens, uh, fair things decline. Um, but thy eternal summer shall not fade, and thou art more lovely than summer, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and by this he means this poem right here. So long as this poem exists and is read by men, gives life to thee. So and there's lots of other poems that sort of work on this theme. This idea that the young man can live immortally in his poetry and by virtue of his pen forever, and that his beauty will live forever through his pen. Um, so right. There we have it. That Shakespeare wrote these love poems to a young man. Okay. Now, they're not always happy poems. It's there's some jealousy involved in some of these poems. It seems there's a rival for the young man's affections, um, and Shakespeare, or the speaker, the subject, seems to be quite a bit older, so age insecurities are an issue. There's some interesting themes that keep popping up. And then there seems to be some sort of a love triangle that I think I mentioned this before, between the young man and the dark lady that shows up in Sonnet 127. So let's talk about the dark lady now. Let's switch over to those sonnets. Who is the dark lady? Okay, so the assumption through most centuries has been that when Shakespeare speaks of a dark lady, it just means that she has dark hair and dark eyes. And so we've already talked about some speculation of who she might be, but recently some scholars have argued that the dark lady may have been literally a black person. And this is not impossible. They've talked about, or they've been able to identify real people who were black in London in this early modern period, who Shakespeare could have had contact with. There's a certain Lucy, or some others that get named sometimes that it could have been. And if you read the poem, well, let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and read through some of the poems, okay? In the old age, black was not counted fair, or if it were, it bore not beauty's name. But now is black beauty's successive heir, and beauty slandered, the bastard shame. For since each hand had put on nature's power, bearing the foul with art's false borrowed face, sweet beauty hath no name, no holy bower, but is profaned if not lives in disgrace. Therefore my mistress's eyes are raven black, her brow so suited, and they mourners seem at such who, not born fair, no beauty lack, slandering creation with a false esteem. Yet so they mourn, becoming of their woe, that every tongue says beauty should look so. Okay, so Shakespeare's actually using the word black here to describe his mistress, this mistress. And yes, mostly the eyes, my mistress's eyes are raven black, but so is her brow so suited. So the question sort of boils down to, what does he mean by black? Because this is also important to note, just like Hamlet's madness, just like the homoerotic love, um, colors and racial colors were not clearly defined in Shakespeare's day the way that they are now. Um, there wasn't necessarily the black race and the white race yet. So it depends on how he's using these color words to describe skin color. You have to remember Shakespeare's writing. I mean, Europe has definitely had contact with African nations at this point. They understand that the African nations are there, and the Spanish and the Portuguese have started enslaving Africans at this point. But the English aren't necessarily quite there yet. We're still maybe a decade or two away from African slaves being brought to the English colonies. Um, and so the racialized differences between black and white and the connotation of slavery aren't very firmly defined. So Shakespeare would not have described himself as a white person. That would not have been terminology that was necessarily used at the time. He would have described him or his race or people that he would have seen just lots of differences. Fair would have been used to describe maybe paler people and beautiful people. So there was that connotation there, but there was also ruddiness, redness, all sorts of different color words that were used at the time to describe a whole host of people who now get lumped in as white. And so darkness, maybe just refers to a lower class person who worked out in the sun and was very deeply tanned and happened to have, black hair and black eyes. It's hard to know. But okay, let's read the second poem here. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. Dun is a very dark brown color, used to describe brown cows. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked, red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks, so her cheeks are not red or white. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with faults compare. It's not clear. It's not clear, but it is very interesting to consider Shakespeare's mistress being of the black race. So let's sort of think about this in terms of manuscript culture then. Oh, we'll get to this in just a second. Which, if you remember, manuscript culture, if Shakespeare was writing these sonnets for a very certain group of people, and not necessarily intended these poems to be read or published or understood by a white audience, it is possible that Shakespeare was playing around with just ideas of transgressive love that the people in his circle may have been interested in exploring. So, love of a young boy, love of a black-skinned mistress. Those could have been Shakespeare playing around with different types of forbidden or transgressive or not necessarily socially accepted um, types of love. And if you look at his plays, this idea shows up in his plays too. Consider Romeo and Juliet. Um, their families were essentially at war. Their families had forbidden their love. So to have those two fall in love is transgressive, forbidden by society and culture of Verona. Othello is the next play we're reading, where we will actually see, a white woman fall in love with a black Moor. Now, again, we'll have to have this discussion again about what color words meant to Shakespeare. What was meant by the term Moor and how black that meant he was, but let's go ahead for the assumption that that we're talking a black man and a white woman having a sexual relationship, and how that would have been viewed at the time as, again, um, not necessarily as wrong as the centuries since then. Wrong is not the right word, right? Because we're totally coming around from that. But in centuries since then, that sort of relationship would have been actually illegal in America. So clearly in Shakespeare's day, not quite that bad, not quite illegal, but still probably not socially normal, right? So Shakespeare does seem to be interested with relationships that are not socially, culturally normalized. So he explores them in his plays, and that's possibly what he's doing in these sonnets, is exploring relationships that are not necessarily socially normalized, or socially acceptable. Um, so yes, that's like what I term transgressive love. The problem is that these transgressive love stories always seem to be sad. Um, his tragedies, they're his tragedies. They never have happy endings. We will see some comedies where we do get some happy ending love stories, but those relationships never seem to be quite as uh, pushing any social envelopes the way these tragic love stories do. Um, so these, and we see that in the sonnets too. Most of the time, these love sonnets are frustrating, right? Um, where Shakespeare's expressing frustration at the problems in these relationships. But just like we talked about with with Romeo and Juliet last week, um, even if Shakespeare's writing about transgressive or imperfect or unhappy love, he can do it in such a beautiful way that he convinces all of us that no matter what, it is great love. Um, so we talked about that balcony scene speech, right? Where we forget that this is, like a 13-year-old girl and a potential pedophile 18-year-old. Okay, sorry. Sorry to refer to Romeo and Juliet that way. But we forget that it's just young kids, because the poetry describing their love is so beautiful. So let's go ahead and take a look at just one example of one of Shakespeare's really famous sonnets where the language, the description of love is so beautiful that Shakespeare manages to convince us that even if it's transgressive or even if it's imperfect or even if it's unhappy love, um, it's still great, great love, right? So, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this be error and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. So, love is not love, which alters when alteration finds. Love lasts. True love lasts forever, through old age and through tempests and whatever trials are thrown at the love, right? Um, so Shakespeare knew how to write beautifully about love, how to convince us it was real. And these sonnets are a super interesting and fascinating way to look at more possible ways that Shakespeare viewed love. Okay, and we'll keep talking about these themes through the rest of Romeo and Juliet, and next week into Othello. So let's keep talking about all of this.